me, the space age is a different thing. It's how we learn to use the technologies that have arisen out of the space age to help solve our problems here on Earth. And as we know, a lot of those things relate to communications, how we tie ourselves together, as IISD has certainly tried to do, bring people from all around the world into dialogue using internet and other mechanisms. That's one. Second thing, and this is very, very important, is our capacity to be able to monitor change, and those things, those satellites that are up there, the radar sat that we've been so proud of developing but don't use very strongly yet in Canada, to allow us to document what's going on in the Arctic, to be able to monitor illegal uses. This is, to me, the tremendously important value of the space technologies. Just going back to the oceans for a minute, we're now starting to wire up the ocean floor so that we can really get an understanding in real-time terms of what are the dynamics of the oceans, what's happening to those fish and the marine mammals, you know, when they move around. What about the cycles of productivity? Very complicated stuff that the space age technologies help us with. So I guess I want to turn the interest in space back into looking at ourselves and the planet we inhabit, and going back to that very first my environmental awakening at the time of the 1960s, and the image that guides us all was the image of the globe from space, viewed from space. This beautiful green and blue thing we call planet Earth. And at that time, and I was a graduate student in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I'd gone to study for my doctoral work, and we came up with a slogan, and we sold something like 75,000 pins that said, "Give Earth a chance." So that's my take on space. From the point of view of our knowledge of it, some people say we know the face of the moon better than we know what happens in some parts of our oceans. Dead zones in the ocean, for example, which are created through land-based sources of pollution off Louisiana, off the Bohai Sea in China, the Arctic, where we find all these nasty pollutants that we really were very surprised to find there, because they aren't manufactured in the Arctic. The level of mercury pollution, for example, the level of the various hydrocarbon contaminants that are found there. They're coming transported either by air or through the ocean currents into the Arctic Ocean. They end up in marine mammals, which the people eat, and what is called country food in the Arctic, and very important in their diet. But they've got limitations now in their diet because the level of contamination is so high. You referred to the salmon. I think the salmon's a good example of a sad problem, and that is we've worked our management systems for a species, the several species of salmon, around notions that we can understand. So population dynamics models, for example, of fisheries management. But we don't have models that are robust enough to take into account environmental change. And the environmental change that we're going to find is related to climate change in the oceans. So it may be that no matter how good we're able to manage fishing pressures, and we haven't proven ourselves very well in that for sure, but even if we can do that, we might still lose the salmon populations on the west coast of Canada. In fact, there's already evidence that a number of species are now going straight into the Arctic, the salmonid species. So the Inuit are finding these in rivers in the Arctic. Maybe they'll be the fishers of the future. But I would also say, and this is a very interesting example, one that's very relevant to Canada. 2 years ago, I was up in the hamlet of Tuktoyaktuk, and I came aboard a Coast Guard research vessel up the Mackenzie River, and we docked in Inuvik. And there was a boat that had been transported by land all the way from the west coast of British Columbia, all the way up to the gateway to the Arctic Ocean. And they were there to do test fishing, because they knew that there were species now in the Arctic that weren't there previously, and they wanted to be first in line to be able to exploit these. So this is where we've got to in the world, that we have now situations in our oceans that we don't understand, that are very dynamic, and that have major economic influences. as we know from the fisheries. And when fisheries collapse, it costs governments a huge amount of money, billions of dollars in the case of the East Coast fisheries, because they have to support the fishing communities and the fishing families. We have aquaculture, highly controversial in Canada, but in Asia, an immense and growing occupation, and very innovative in terms of how the creatures are being cultivated. On the other hand, there's serious questions there about sustainability. So these are just a couple of examples. The broader example that I'd like to leave with you in terms of thinking about how we address these problems is that it's clear we are going to use the oceans more intensively, that half the world's people live on the shore of the oceans or within 100 kilometers, something like that. The huge cities in Asia, North America, Europe that are now located along the shores put an additional burden on the oceans. So we have to learn to think about these kinds of activities, plus those related to oil, drilling, transportation, so on, in an integrative kind of framework, so that we know the impacts of one sector on another, and so that we understand the ecosystemic basis for our use of the oceans. Now, I think that's a crucial thing that we have to work out over the next, let us say, 10, 20, 30 years, how to do that. And the scientists are extremely helpful on that issue. They really do give us a lot of good advice. The second point would be that, and I don't understand why we don't bring this more into the climate change debate, but the oceans are an essential part of the climate change debate. And partly because the energy shifts and so on that take place, that we see as intensive weather, wet weather. Where I live now in Victoria, it's been raining constantly. That's as a result of La Nina. We understand that, but we don't understand how El Nino and La Nina will be changed by climate change, for example. And so we need to keep building the scientific basis of knowledge. But in addition to that, we now have to have a predictive capacity about what is happening to the oceans. One of the big problems, for example, that people are worrying about is the acidification of the oceans as a consequence of the carbon dioxide dynamics that are changing from climate change. Now, if this happens on the scale that is being discussed, it could reduce the overall productivity of the oceans, which would have an immense impact on how we can use the oceans. So these are issues, and they really are today's issues. They're not for some distant time, 200 years from now. They're just around the corner for us, and I could go on and on about that. So I feel, both in terms of our understanding of what would be a framework for sustainable use of the oceans, we're not as advanced as we are on the land side. And secondly, if we did have that framework, it's still a very difficult thing to be able to ask, how can we implement it? And so I'll leave it at that. But oceans are very important to us. That's the bottom line message. My own hope, and I think really feeling of concern, is that we have so many pressures on the environment now, and we have so many ways we have to create changes between the relationship of environment and economy, or environment and development, that this latest round will have real lasting benefits. Now, that takes me to where we are right now, and that's in the year 2008, looking ahead at the 2012 end of the Kyoto Protocol and what will replace it, various targets that have been put in place for biodiversity conservation that aren't being met, the Millennium Development Goals to reduce poverty, which includes a very large environmental component. These kinds of goals are absolutely critical. What we do during this next 5 to 7 years should set the stage, the transformative stage, of implementation of sustainable development that will take us through to the 2020-2030 period. If we do a lousy job of it now, we're going to pay a very high price in those years 2020 to 2030 and beyond that period. And so we're not really doing justice either to ourselves or particularly to the future generations that will follow us, our children, our grandchildren, and so on. So really, we have to take this long-term perspective and recognize that there's ups and downs, but just because it's up doesn't mean it's going to stay up as a policy issue. And if it starts to go down in the public eye, there's still a great need for action and a great need for building new levels of concern and understanding about just how serious the environment and development relationship is to our future society.